Every film has a pulse that reveals itself slowly, a kind of invisible rhythm that governs both its creation and its story. In this one, that rhythm felt like pursuit, steady, relentless, measured by breath more than by beats. To live through its making was to live inside motion itself, where every decision carried the weight of time and money flowing in precise synchrony. The Bourne world was no longer discovery. It was continuation, refinement, and risk. Each person involved could feel that truth humming beneath the surface. Success had already been proven, but that proof had become expectation, and expectation costs more than any number can show. From the earliest stages, the film's financial journey felt like running downhill. Momentum both gift and threat. The team stepped into a world where everything was already in motion. Scripts evolving, schedules forming, commitments stacking like dominoes. The pace was exhilarating but unforgiving. Money did not arrive as a slow build of faith this time. It came quickly, shaped by confidence. Yet that same speed created its own fragility. What had once been a gamble was now a standard, and standards demand precision. Every expenditure felt visible, every choice measured against the legacy of its predecessors. The challenge was not to exceed but to sustain, to hold the same level of tension, the same intimacy of chaos, without collapsing under its weight. Those who managed its finances understood that the film's pulse had to remain invisible. The money had to move without being felt. It was there in the camera's unbroken chase, in the seamless transitions across continents, in the precision of editing that made the impossible look effortless. But no one watching could ever sense the scaffolding beneath that motion. The money became like air, essential, unseen, taken for granted until it faltered. Keeping it flowing required choreography as intricate as the film's fight sequences. Approvals signed in minutes, logistics aligned in hours, schedules balanced like a blade between momentum and exhaustion. What appeared on screen, the cities, the motion, the silence before the storm, was only the visible side of a structure built through coordination. Each location change represented a web of transactions, permissions, and negotiations that pulsed quietly in the background. The production crossed borders as easily as its protagonist did, but the ease was illusion. Behind every move stood weeks of timing, conversions, and assurances. The team who managed that flow learned to think globally in the most literal sense. Their work was geography made tangible through ledgers, their precision measured not in currency but in time saved, delays avoided, harmony maintained. Inside that structure, emotion was not absent. It simply took a quieter form. There was pride in efficiency, satisfaction in the knowledge that motion continued without rupture. When things went right, the joy was silent. When things slowed, tension filled the room like static. To work on this film was to internalize its tone, cool, focused, unsentimental, yet deeply human beneath the surface. The crew moved with the same intensity as the character they followed, chasing completion through fatigue and repetition. Each day's end was not relief but reset. The rhythm never stopped. The financial journey was inseparable from this tempo. Unlike the earlier chapters, which carried a certain fragility of belief, this one carried momentum that bordered on inevitability. Yet inevitability breeds its own pressure. There was no safety in success. There was only the fear of losing alignment. The money followed that anxiety, steady but tense, abundant but closely guarded. Each department operated within invisible walls of accountability. The feeling was less about limitation and more about containment. Every cent, every hour, every adjustment had to feel like it belonged to the same system. To those inside, the production felt like living inside a mechanism. The gears were massive but exact, turning with practiced friction. You could hear them in the background of every conversation. People talking not only about what to shoot but when, how, and what ripple each decision might cause. Money had become motion's translator. It converted intention into action, energy into continuity. That translation was delicate. Too much urgency and things overextended. Too much caution and the film lost pace. The balance required intuition. The accountants learned to read scripts like choreographers. the producers learned to count seconds as though they were dollars. The result was a film that seemed to move effortlessly through its world, yet behind that fluidity lay months of orchestration. The camera's restlessness mirrored the financial one. Both sought movement without waste. Each scene's compression, the quick cuts, the kinetic tracking, the tension that built through space, was born from the production's lived awareness of cost and time. The form mirrored the process perfectly. In both, precision was survival. As the film's journey advanced, those involved began to feel its strange symmetry. The story of a man piecing together fragments of his identity echoed the production's own attempt to reconcile past and present. The prior films had established tone, method, and expectation. This one had to carry them forward while redefining them. Financially, that meant building on the proven while refusing repetition. The tension between safety and risk shaped every meeting, every allocation. To repeat was to stagnate. To overreach was to jeopardize. They found balance through motion, never staying still long enough for doubt to harden. By mid-production, the emotional texture of money had shifted. It no longer felt like uncertainty. It felt like endurance. The people who had once worried about funding now worried about stamina, about how to sustain perfection under time's compression. Every shoot day stretched energy thinner. What had once been calculation turned into pure resolve. Crews pushed through exhaustion not because of urgency but because momentum itself demanded it. To stop, even briefly, felt like betraying rhythm. The film's financial path, though stable, carried an undercurrent of human fatigue. Money kept flowing, but time, its closest ally, grew scarce. Each day's expenses told a story not of indulgence but of compression. Every dollar reflected minutes fought for, compromises restructured, exhaustion delayed. The real cost of the film was not monetary but physiological, the quiet toll taken by precision over repetition. And yet, there was pride in that cost. The exhaustion became proof of commitment, the fatigue a sign of alignment. Everyone was giving exactly what the story required. Movement without pause, clarity without comfort. When the shooting phase finally ended, the silence that followed felt unnatural. 4 months, the set had been a living organism of coordination and response. Now, in post-production, the energy condensed into screens and edits. Money no longer funded movement but refinement. The rhythm slowed but did not relax. It merely changed key. The editors worked like surgeons, each cut an incision through time. Behind them, producers and financiers continued their own meticulous balancing act, ensuring that the project's final stage held the same discipline as its chase scenes. As deadlines approached, the pressure of timing reasserted itself. Cash flow met calendar, each day drawing tighter. Yet unlike the early tension of uncertainty, this was a tension of completion, a final surge toward the finish line. Relief hovered in the air but never arrived early. Only when the last sound, the final frame, the closing note were locked did the weight begin to lift. People who had lived months in perpetual motion finally exhaled, though even their relief carried the restraint of habit. When the film reached the public, the team experienced a moment of suspended awareness. The story they had built out of momentum now belonged to others, but their minds remained attuned to process. They read reviews like ledgers, watching tone rather than content, measuring stability rather than acclaim. For them, success meant coherence, the confirmation that the rhythm they had maintained internally translated externally. When they saw that the film's energy carried the same relentless pulse in the audience's response, the realization felt deeper than profit. It meant that the system had held. Looking back, the money journey of this film revealed an evolution. What began years earlier as risk had matured into mastery. The same instincts that once sought survival now sought precision. Those who had been there from the start could see how far things had come, from fragile hope to confident balance. Yet with confidence came humility. The process had taught them that success never simplifies. It complicates differently. Stability brings new forms of strain, and perfection carries its own quiet danger, the expectation to repeat it again. Even in reflection, The financial memory remained physical. People remembered not numbers but sensations. The rush of last-minute approvals, the vibration of phones at dawn, the relief of confirmation emails, the tension in shoulders that never quite eased. These were the real residues of the film's economy. The emotional imprints of a system that had turned labor into momentum. For many involved, this project marked the end of a cycle. They could feel it in the tone of rapt conversations, in the way crews hugged longer, in the silence that followed the last day's lunch. The trilogy had completed not only its story but its structure. The money, the energy, the patience, all had come full circle. What remained was a sense of closure that had nothing to do with final numbers. It was the calm that comes when effort and outcome align exactly. The journey of this film proved that money in cinema is not just about access but about translation. It translates faith into frames, logistics into feeling. Here, that translation reached its purest form. Every choice, every risk, every movement felt necessary. Nothing extra remained. The film stood lean, alive, and complete, just as its production had been. Those who lived it carried a rare understanding afterward, that the true measure of financial success in art is not scale but precision, not applause but alignment. To fund a vision so completely that it becomes indistinguishable from discipline, that was the quiet triumph of this film. It showed that when money moves with the same rhythm as story, when logistics breathe in time with emotion, the result transcends both. The film did not just depict control, it embodied it. And in doing so, it closed its own loop, the journey of faith, patience, and motion that began years before, now ending not in excess, but in exactness, where every dollar and every frame found its rightful place. The scale of the film's creation was defined not by size, but by precision. Every decision was drawn toward the center, toward control, rhythm, and economy. The production no longer needed to prove that it could exist, it needed to prove that it could refine. The atmosphere on set carried this quiet confidence, an assurance that came from familiarity, but also an awareness that familiarity brings its own pressure. The world expected seamless motion, and seamless motion demanded a budget built like a heartbeat. Steady, strong, invisible. The sense of space had changed since the earlier chapters. Everything felt faster, tighter, more assured. What had once been an adventure into uncertainty was now a system of pure efficiency. The film's budget was structured not to expand, but to contract, to squeeze every ounce of meaning from the smallest moments. Scale no longer meant the size of the spectacle. It meant the density of what appeared on screen. A narrow alley could feel like an entire world if the tension within it was real enough. The challenge was to make intensity look effortless, and that required discipline in both art and finance. The production's physical rhythm was unrelenting. Each day began before dawn and ended long after the city's lights had cooled. The film's identity demanded realism, which meant locations instead of sets, spontaneity instead of control. Yet even chaos requires structure. The production schedule moved like clockwork: transport, light, shoot, move, repeat. There was no room for drift, no space for indulgence. The film's tone, its restlessness, its clarity, was built from that same order. Every frame carried the pressure of precision. Every angle felt earned. To walk onto set was to feel both simplicity and strain. There were no extravagant builds, no towering backdrops. There was movement, tension, repetition. The crew carried their purpose like a pulse. Each department knew its place within the machine. Camera rigs were stripped to their lightest forms, lighting plans drawn to match natural sources, sound operators woven seamlessly into motion. Even the smallest changes had cascading effects. An additional take could mean an extra truck hour a shifted permit. The budget was a living document, adjusted daily, breathing with the film itself. But the restraint that defined the production was not austerity. It was focus. The film's success depended on its authenticity, and authenticity came from presence, not polish. Every expenditure was judged by that standard. Would it make the world feel lived in, immediate, true? If not, it was cut. The discipline was not cold. It was purposeful. What the audience would later describe as grit was built from hundreds of small acts of decision, each one a choice to prioritize truth over comfort. Morale on set mirrored this precision. There was fatigue, of course, but also pride. Everyone understood they were working within a framework that demanded their best without wasting their time. The long days carried a strange serenity. Repetition became rhythm, and rhythm became focus. The actors felt it too. They moved through real streets, real spaces, their performances shaped by the physicality of the world around them. The camera's proximity, the lack of barriers, made every gesture more human, every mistake more meaningful. Early creative choices had quietly set these parameters. From the first meeting, the director had insisted that the film's tone, immediacy, movement, control, would dictate everything. The cinematography had to move like thought. The editing had to breathe like instinct. That philosophy became budget logic. Smaller crews, faster setups, minimal interference. The production needed to travel light, both physically and financially. That lightness became liberation. By limiting resources, the team gained agility, and agility allowed authenticity. The film's visual texture came from that very economy. Instead of flooding the frame with light, they worked within darkness. Instead of constructing elaborate sets, they repurposed existing structures. Each location carried its own history, its own imperfections, and those imperfections became part of the art. The crew learned to treat constraints as collaborators. When time was short, they embraced it. When weather shifted, they adapted. The lack of predictability gave the film its pulse. What others might have called problems became proof of realism. Within this structure, every department carried its own form of restraint. Wardrobe found expression through wear and repetition. Props leaned toward functionality over decoration. Vehicles, technology, and even sound effects were chosen for precision, not spectacle. The entire production operated under the idea that less detail meant more truth. The simplicity was deceptive. To make something look this immediate required layers of planning that never showed themselves. The scale of human labor behind the camera was vast, though it moved in silence. Dozens of people coordinated through glances and gestures rather than commands. They worked in narrow corridors, crowded intersections, rooftops overlooking cities that never paused for them. The financial rhythm that supported them was equally tight. Payments, approvals, logistics, all flowing like current beneath the surface. The money never stopped, but it never swelled. It moved efficiently, silently, always in service to momentum. In moments of stillness, between takes or travel, the team would feel the weight of what they were building. The exhaustion was collective but purposeful. There was something purifying about the process. The absence of excess made every contribution visible. The camera operator's timing, the lighting technician's adjustment, the sound mixer's instinct, all mattered. The budget's restraint had created equality. Everyone's precision contributed to the film's coherence. Over time, the set developed its own rhythm of silence and noise. During action, everything exploded into movement. Between shots, the quiet returned. Those pauses held meaning. They were not laziness or delay but reflection. Moments when the enormity of coordination could be felt. The production scale existed not in spectacle but in the density of attention, the way every small act contributed to something vast. By the time the film neared completion, the crew's connection had turned almost instinctual. They no longer needed direction. They moved as a single system. That cohesion was the truest sign of success. A budget cannot buy harmony, but it can create conditions for it. Here, the structure had done exactly that. The limitations had not crushed creativity. They had refined it. When the last location wrapped, the relief that spread across the team was quiet, not celebratory. Everyone felt emptied yet fulfilled. They had built something intricate through simplicity, complex through precision. The scale they had achieved was internal, a mastery of motion and control that would never show itself but could always be felt. Looking back, those who lived it would describe the production not as large or small, but as exact. Every resource had found its rightful place. Every effort had mattered. The film's realism, the way it felt grounded yet heightened, came directly from that balance. It was the art of doing only what must be done and doing it perfectly. In the final weeks of editing, when footage from cities and corners around the world passed through the same hands, the scope of what had been accomplished finally became visible. It wasn't measured in cost but in coherence. The images lined up with the emotion behind them. The rhythm of the cut matched the rhythm of the work. What had begun as budget constraint had become aesthetic unity. That unity was the real scale. It extended beyond money, beyond logistics, into the hearts of those who made it. They had discovered something elemental. That control is not the opposite of creativity, but its frame. Inside that frame, everything became sharper, more human, more alive. And when the film was done, those who had built it carried that understanding with them. That true scale is not about size, but about precision, and that the greatest luxury in filmmaking is clarity. The rhythm of support for this film began long before the first camera turned. It was not born from chance or persuasion. It came from continuation, from the quiet confidence that follows proof. Those who had been part of the earlier journeys returned not out of obligation but belief, and yet belief, at this stage, was no longer simple faith. It was a practiced awareness of what creation required. Patience, calibration, timing. Financing this chapter was less about finding resources and more about aligning them, arranging commitment in a sequence that mirrored the story's own motion. Relentless, fluid, inevitable. Early conversations moved like rehearsed dialogue. Everyone understood the rhythm, the pauses, the undertones of risk. The project carried momentum, but momentum needed management. Money had to arrive not all at once but at the right intervals, each stage of support coinciding with production's evolving pulse. Those closest to the numbers saw time as currency. They spoke of trust in terms of rhythm. Too early and funds would stagnate, too late and motion would falter. The art of this film's financing was timing disguised as confidence. At the start, the mood was calm. Meetings did not carry the desperate urgency of an unproven idea. The earlier success had built a foundation of quiet assurance, but assurance brings its own weight. The expectation was not simply to deliver another film. It was to maintain an unbroken thread of quality, tone, and energy. That awareness shaped how support lined up. Early contributors arrived quickly, almost instinctively, knowing the machinery well. Their involvement brought security, yet also structure. Familiarity meant fewer questions but tighter oversight. Freedom was granted within invisible borders, a delicate equilibrium between faith and accountability. As commitments formalized, the financial rhythm settled into its natural tempo. There were no sudden surges, no dramatic rescues, just steady flow. Those who had once fought to secure belief now managed continuity. The greatest challenge was not scarcity but synchronization. With filming planned across continents, the team had to choreograph money the way they choreographed movement. Precise, responsive, never static. Payments, approvals, and expenses all followed invisible choreography. To miss a beat meant delay. To keep time meant survival. Inside the production offices, days began with coordination. The air carried the hum of communication. Calls to banks, emails across time zones, signatures passed through scanners. It was less negotiation than orchestration. Everyone knew the pattern by heart. The earlier films had built a network of understanding between producers, financiers, and crews. This one ran on that history. Yet even history needed maintenance. Confidence, once granted, required care. Every report, every update, every acknowledgement of progress served to sustain the fragile balance between faith and fact. Those who lived through this process spoke later of its peculiar calm. It lacked the adrenaline of high-risk financing but demanded a subtler endurance. The task was not to ignite belief but to preserve it, to keep movement constant, expectation aligned, energy unbroken. That steadiness could feel deceptive, almost too smooth, but beneath it ran an intricate web of timing that required constant adjustment. Money never sleeps. It shifts in response to motion. When the production changed location, resources followed like shadows. The system worked only because everyone trusted it to. The earliest phases of financing were marked by a quiet kind of intimacy. Those responsible for aligning resources worked in small rooms late into the night, recalibrating plans each time a new logistical detail emerged. When the schedule extended by a day, the adjustment rippled through everything. Payroll, transport, accommodation, catering. Nothing was isolated. Everything connected. They learned to think like editors, cutting, splicing, rearranging, until the financial structure flowed as seamlessly as the story would on screen. During production, the rhythm of cash became indistinguishable from the rhythm of work. Every decision, whether to extend a take, to move a location, to reshoot, carried a cost measured not only in currency but in energy. The production managers understood that their timing shaped morale. Money had to appear before tension grew visible. Payments made on time became reassurance. Delays, even brief ones, created ripples of uncertainty. In this world, financial timing was emotional management. Stability bred focus. Hesitation bred fatigue. As the days blurred into weeks, those managing flow began to feel the same urgency as the characters being filmed. Every step forward depended on precision. They worked in tandem with production schedules, translating logistics into liquidity, ensuring that nothing interrupted motion. There were nights when the pace felt too fast, when the pressure to maintain continuity became its own test of endurance. But the satisfaction of seeing it all align, the trucks, the transfers, the travel, was worth the exhaustion. They were building an organism that moved without friction. When the project entered its middle stage, financing became more than maintenance. It became intuition. The producers could anticipate needs before they arose, adjusting allocations before requests appeared. This anticipation created stability. Everyone trusted the process not because it was perfect but because it responded. And when minor imbalances appeared, a delayed invoice, a miscommunication, they were resolved with the same quiet efficiency that had defined the shoot. The calm confidence that ran through the production was mirrored in its finances. Constant vigilance without panic, flexibility without excess. Yet beneath that steadiness, emotion still lived. The people closest to the movement of money often carried invisible tension. They bore responsibility for the invisible threads that held the film together. A single misstep could stall an entire sequence. They learned to breathe through the stress, to find composure in repetition. Over time, they began to mirror the film's central theme: control under pressure. Financing, like the story, became an exercise in endurance. When shooting neared its end, the rhythm began to change. Money no longer drove preparation but completion. The focus shifted from expansion to consolidation, from funding movement to funding assembly. The post-production phase required patience. Payments slowed, approvals stretched, new kinds of calculations appeared. Those who had managed immediacy now managed longevity, ensuring that the project's energy did not fade as its pace eased. It was a new form of timing, less about speed, more about balance. The final stages of financing brought reflection. Everyone involved could see how far the project had traveled without rupture. There had been no crises, no last-minute rescues, no sudden recalibrations. The system had held. That steadiness, once taken for granted, now felt extraordinary. It revealed how deeply experience shapes confidence. The financiers no longer watched for emergencies. They observed continuity. The producers no longer fought to justify belief. They protected momentum. The film had matured, and so had its handling of money. When the accounts finally aligned, what lingered was not relief but quiet pride. The people who had orchestrated its support understood that success was not measured by abundance but by flow. Money had arrived when it needed to, moved where it should, and ended where it must. The rhythm had been perfect. Not a single beat early, not a single one missed. The result was something rare, a production that moved as smoothly as its own narrative. Looking back, the team recognized that timing had been the truest form of faith. The early believers had committed not just funds but patience. The late arrivals had brought not just resources but perspective. Together, they had built a current strong enough to carry the film without turbulence. The experience taught them that in filmmaking, as in story, rhythm is destiny. Financing had not merely supported the film, it had mirrored it, matching pace for pace, breath for breath, until both reached their quiet, inevitable conclusion. Completion without collapse, confidence without noise. Ambition lived quietly at the heart of this film. It was not the loud, expansive kind that sought to overwhelm. It was inward, precise, and measured. The creative scope was defined less by scale and more by the refinement of control. Everyone involved knew the tone had already been established by what came before: restraint, velocity, realism, and the task now was to carry those qualities forward without losing intimacy. The film's ambition, therefore, was not to grow larger, but to grow clearer, to push precision to its breaking point without shattering it. In the early stages, that ambition revealed itself as focus. Meetings were filled not with dreams of expansion but with questions of texture. How to make chaos feel human, how to maintain truth inside movement, how to evolve style without betraying it. The film's creative identity was a form of discipline. Every new idea had to justify itself emotionally before it could exist practically. This became the silent budget logic, every cost aligned with meaning, every vision tested by purpose. Extravagance had no place because it offered nothing to the story's pulse. The team understood that ambition could be destructive if not contained. They had seen how too much freedom in storytelling could dilute tone. Here, freedom meant precision, knowing when to move and when to hold. That understanding shaped everything: camera design, color tone, performance rhythm. The world on screen had to feel larger in scope yet smaller in focus, a paradox achieved through control rather than addition. The film's creative choices reflected this philosophy. Every chase, every silence, every confrontation was designed not to impress but to immerse, not to show power but to reveal vulnerability. Early creative conversations revolved around emotion rather than image. The question was not how to make the film look good, but how to make it feel inevitable. The restraint that had defined the earlier stories was sharpened here into structure. The tone had to be colder, leaner, more immediate, yet still human. To reach that level of clarity, the team made hundreds of decisions that appeared small but carried immense weight. They removed anything that might distract, anything that signaled control too openly. The film had to move as if it were alive, spontaneous, unpredictable, breathing in sync with the character's pulse. These choices shaped the film's financial identity. Each department learned to think like storytellers, not spenders. The production design team created spaces that felt temporary, transitional, rooms, corridors, rooftops, each filled with evidence of passing lives. Nothing looked staged, yet everything was meticulously planned. The camera department stripped down its equipment to favor movement over comfort. Even the editing room operated under the same principle: economy of motion, clarity of intent. Every frame mattered. The first major constraint appeared in geography. The story demanded multiple cities, each distinct in mood yet unified in tone. To achieve that coherence, the team avoided grand spectacle. They sought texture instead: light bouncing off concrete, reflection in rain, the blur of a passing train. The challenge was to make each place feel lived in without overwhelming the narrative. The solution was rhythm: short bursts of energy followed by silence. These shifts mirrored both the character's state of mind and the financial architecture behind the production. Nothing lingered longer than it needed to. For the actors, the creative scope meant intensity. Performances were built on restraint, not expression. They were instructed to hold rather than project, to communicate through stillness rather than speech. That approach demanded patience. Retakes focused not on dialogue but on rhythm, timing, breath. The result was raw and unfiltered, yet technically demanding. The creative discipline became a form of psychological endurance, where every choice had to feel necessary. The director's approach reflected the same budget logic that guided every department: limit options to sharpen clarity. Long rehearsals gave way to instinctive takes. Controlled lighting replaced elaborate setups. The creative process was not about layering but reduction, removing anything that didn't serve the pulse of immediacy. That simplicity gave the film its strength. By confining expression, the team found freedom. The camera could chase movement without losing meaning. The story could expand without feeling loose. Trade-offs defined the production. There were sequences that, on paper, demanded more resources than time or money could allow. Instead of expanding outward, the team went inward, tightening scope until intensity replaced spectacle. The decisions were quiet but transformative. An explosion replaced by silence, a wide shot replaced by a reflection, a dialogue scene shot in shadow rather than sunlight. Each compromise deepened mood. The absence of excess became its own kind of abundance. These constraints shaped morale. Working within limits created unity. Every person understood that the budget was not an obstacle but a framework. It set the rhythm for performance, for patience, for pride. The team stopped measuring success by what could be added and started measuring it by what could be removed. When a scene played perfectly with less coverage, there was quiet satisfaction. When an unplanned adjustment turned out better than design, it reinforced the truth that control can coexist with chance. As filming advanced, fatigue began to merge with purpose. The creative scope demanded constant alertness. No one could hide behind extravagance. Mistakes showed immediately, but that transparency fostered trust. Departments depended on one another completely, each contributing precision that became invisible once the frame rolled. The production existed in a fragile balance, no room for excess, no tolerance for chaos, yet constantly flirting with both. The tension of maintaining that equilibrium became part of the film's aesthetic. When post-production began, the same philosophy guided every cut. The editor treated footage like material under a blade. Every frame was tested for necessity. There were no indulgent shots, no visual ornament. The sound design followed suit, creating impact through absence as much as presence. The result was a film that felt faster than it was, leaner than its scale suggested, and richer for its restraint. In hindsight, the creative constraints proved to be the film's secret luxury. The lack of freedom created focus. The lack of time created instinct. The film's controlled urgency on screen was born directly from the production's own rhythm. Its realism wasn't performed. It was lived. The budget logic had translated into emotion. The precision that shaped the money had shaped the mood, and both existed in perfect synchrony. Looking back, those who made it could trace the emotional logic behind every decision. The ambition to be larger had given way to the ambition to be exact. The refusal to overreach had given the film its coherence. The constant trade-offs between scale and focus, between spectacle and restraint, had carved out something rare. A film that existed entirely within its means and yet felt boundless in scope. When the final version was locked, the team could sense they had reached a new kind of balance. They had made something that carried weight without mass, urgency without noise, emotion without excess. The financial restraint had become aesthetic mastery. It had turned limitation into momentum, pressure into clarity. The creative scope had revealed itself not as expansion, but as refinement, the art of holding tension so precisely that it becomes invisible. In the end, that was the film's real ambition: to prove that precision could move people more than spectacle ever could, that control could evoke chaos more truthfully than excess. The production had lived that truth every day, inside every frame, until the boundaries between artistic intent and practical reality dissolved. What remained was pure rhythm, the steady pulse of a film that knew exactly what it was and had the courage to be nothing else. Awareness began long before the first trailer appeared. It moved through whispers, glimpses, small signals, a name resurfacing, a familiar face in motion, the return of a rhythm people already trusted. The audience did not need to be told what this film was. They felt it before seeing it. That was the advantage and the weight of legacy. The marketing did not build anticipation from scratch. It had to sustain it without overplaying the note. Those who guided its path understood this immediately. Familiarity was the story, and restraint was the strategy. The earliest discussions around awareness centered on tone. The campaign needed to feel like the film itself. Tense, economical, direct. There could be no exaggeration, no false promise of spectacle. Every piece of promotion had to communicate control. That principle shaped every decision. The first images, the pacing of teasers, even the typography. Each element carried precision. The story was not sold through color or noise, but through movement and quiet. The awareness campaign became an extension of the film's atmosphere. The first trailer was assembled like a heartbeat. It avoided voiceover, avoided exposition. It moved in fragments, a glance, a breath, a chase beginning mid-motion. The marketing team understood that audiences did not need to know what the film was about. They needed to feel how it moved. The imagery carried its own pulse, and the cuts were timed to match it. By the end of those 2 minutes, the film had already communicated everything essential. Speed, memory, survival. The audience recognized the pattern and trusted it. As these fragments reached the public, anticipation rose not in waves but in vibrations. The film's awareness spread through rhythm rather than volume. Articles appeared, features followed, but the tone remained consistent. Subtle, grounded, confident. Every piece of press was measured. The campaign spoke in the same voice as the film. Calm under pressure. This created an unusual dynamic. The audience leaned forward to listen rather than being overwhelmed by noise. That listening became its own form of participation. Inside the studio, the mood was cautious optimism. The team could feel the temperature rising, but they refused to accelerate it artificially. The schedule of releases, trailers, stills, interviews, followed a deliberate sequence, like the pacing of scenes. The people managing it spoke in terms of rhythm rather than marketing. The campaign had its own internal clock, one that aligned perfectly with the film's production logic. Tension, release, silence, return. That synchronization gave everything a sense of inevitability. The awareness strategy also depended on precision in presentation. The posters carried no clutter, no blur of characters or taglines. One face, one color tone, one motion. The image conveyed the entire narrative in a single frame. A man running through blur, clarity surrounded by chaos. It was not just design. It was philosophy. Every public-facing choice repeated the same mantra. Precision, restraint, focus. Those values had guided the film's making and now guided its conversation with the world. What made the campaign remarkable was its consistency. From digital presence to television spots, from interviews to billboards, every appearance of the film spoke the same emotional language. Even the interviews felt part of the design. The actors and director avoided grand statements. They spoke of rhythm, collaboration, humanity. Their words, stripped of hype, carried more weight because they sounded like the film itself, measured and exact. The public sensed authenticity in that restraint. As awareness expanded globally, the campaign adapted without losing tone. Each region received its own visual emphasis, yet all shared the same palette. Muted steel, motion blur, human stillness. The design choices mirrored the universality of the story. The chase was not cultural. It was elemental. The marketing did not explain this. It embodied it. The result was coherence across continents. Audiences everywhere recognized the film's essence instantly. The financial logic behind this awareness was as refined as the aesthetic one. The spend-to-reach ratio prioritized timing over saturation. Advertising was concentrated in specific bursts, aligned with key dates rather than spread thin across months. This created a sense of urgency. The campaign appeared, disappeared, and reappeared, like the character himself, always present yet elusive. That pattern built intrigue more effectively than constant exposure ever could. It was rhythm translated into economics. Within the studio, as the release approached, the team tracked the subtler signs of awareness. The tone of conversation, the quiet build of curiosity, the consistency of mentions across channels. They were not chasing numbers. They were measuring mood. Each signal confirmed that the strategy of restraint was working. The audience wasn't overwhelmed. They were waiting. Anticipation, in its purest form, is patience charged with energy, and that was exactly what the campaign had achieved. For the filmmakers, watching this awareness unfold felt surreal. The story they had lived in isolation for months was now public property, yet its presentation remained true. There was pride in that fidelity. There was pride in that fidelity. The marketing had not distorted the film's soul, it had amplified it. The posters, the trailers, the controlled messaging, all felt like extensions of the same creative discipline that had shaped the shoot. The boundary between art and advertisement had blurred. As the release date neared, the internal atmosphere shifted from focus to quiet excitement. Reports from early screenings suggested that the audience response matched the tone of expectation. There was recognition in the silence that followed the first preview screenings, an echo of the film's own rhythm. People left theaters thoughtful rather than overwhelmed, stirred rather than stunned. The awareness had prepared them perfectly for that experience. The campaign's restraint also had a financial advantage: efficiency. Money had not been scattered across platforms. It had been directed precisely, every dollar guided by intent. The confidence of the product allowed for minimal noise. The creative clarity of the film had made the marketing self-sufficient. When a film speaks so clearly, it markets itself. The awareness strategy had merely translated that clarity into sequence and structure. In retrospect, those involved understood how awareness had become identity. The marketing did not sell the film, it became part of its narrative. The visuals and tone of the campaign now live in memory alongside the story itself. The world no longer separated the two. The awareness strategy had achieved the rarest of outcomes: invisibility. The audience felt anticipation but never manipulation. They arrived at the theater not because they were told to, but because they wanted to see where that quiet rhythm led. When the campaign concluded and the film took its first steps into public conversation, the studio team looked back at the process with rare satisfaction. Every signal had landed, every rhythm had held, every restraint had been justified. The awareness had mirrored the art. The film had entered the world exactly as it had been made: controlled, confident, and precise. There was no noise, no distortion, only the hum of anticipation turning into applause. That, in the end, was the greatest triumph of its awareness journey. It proved that marketing could move with the same integrity as art, that clarity could generate desire, and that restraint, when executed with confidence, could fill a room louder than any advertisement. The campaign had built not hype but trust, and trust lasts longer than noise. When the lights dimmed and the story began, audiences already knew what kind of film they were about to see. They had been feeling its pulse for months. The first weekend carried the kind of tension that had lived beneath the film since the moment it began: quiet, exact, and tightly wound. For those who had made it, the opening was not about celebration, it was about calibration. The release was treated like an experiment in rhythm. Everything had been built with restraint, so even now, as the film entered the world, the tone inside the team remained composed. The goal was to listen before reacting, to feel the world's response as texture rather than headline. In the hours leading to that first night, people across time zones refreshed inboxes, checked updates, called one another in half-whispers. The film was everywhere and yet nowhere, showing in cities scattered across continents, playing to strangers who carried no memory of the long days behind its making. For the team, that distance felt both freeing and unbearable. They had released control, and now the story belonged to others. The weight of that transition was heavy but clean. The first signals arrived early. Reports from theaters described rooms that were silent while the film played and alive with discussion after. There were no outbursts, no confusion, only focus. The audience reacted the same way the filmmakers had made the film, through attention. That silence was the truest applause. When early numbers began to appear, they arrived without drama, the kind of stability that carried weight precisely because it lacked surprise. The film had entered the world exactly as it had been built. Steady, confident, unforced. Inside the production offices, the mood shifted from tension to reflection. The opening weekend was not being measured by size but by proportion. The conversation was not about victory but about tone, how well the film had landed within itself. There were charts and projections, yes, but they felt peripheral. The team talked instead about perception, about how the film's identity had translated. What mattered most was whether the world had seen what they had intended it to see. As reactions spread, they could tell it had. The precision that guided every cut, every moment, every choice was visible to those who watched. The first night after the opening felt different from any before it. For the first time in months, the people who had carried the film's weight slept. Their messages to one another were brief, almost reluctant, as if releasing attention took practice. They had lived so long inside detail that letting go of control felt unnatural. But gradually, a kind of calm took hold. They began to realize that the film no longer needed them. It had achieved what every project hopes for: independence. In the following days, the team watched the rhythm of the film's trajectory unfold. The conversations surrounding it were precise, analytical, appreciative. Critics focused on tone and motion rather than spectacle. Audiences discussed its pacing, its realism, its restraint. The responses echoed the creative and financial structure that had built it, measured and exact. There were no extremes, no shockwaves, just a continuous hum of acknowledgement. The film had found its equilibrium in public the same way it had found it in production. The financial analysts tracking the weekend's outcome recognized a rare pattern: consistency. The film held its numbers evenly across territories, its performance stable rather than explosive. It didn't rely on a single surge of excitement but on sustained engagement. The data read like a reflection of its making: balanced, deliberate, quietly powerful. The studio saw not volatility but rhythm, not luck but control. This was not the film that demanded attention. It was the one that earned it. For the filmmakers, that steadiness became its own kind of validation. They had spent years refining the art of motion without chaos, emotion without sentimentality, and now the audience was responding to that clarity. The early chatter about performances, direction, and pacing all carried the same recognition. Precision could move as deeply as passion. Those who had crafted the film felt seen in that response. Their control had been understood as intention, not limitation. Behind the scenes, among the financial and production teams, the talk was less emotional but no less meaningful. The weekend reports confirmed what everyone had quietly hoped for: that the structure had held, that timing had worked, that restraint had been rewarded. There were no last-minute corrections, no damage control. Everything moved as designed. The systems of release, promotion, and exhibition aligned perfectly. To those who managed them, that smoothness felt like beauty. They saw elegance in the absence of emergency. For the cast and crew, the weekend blurred between public and private relief. Publicly, they smiled for interviews, spoke of teamwork, shared gratitude. As the second and third days passed, patterns emerged. Audiences returned. Word spread quietly but firmly. The film had not ignited a frenzy. It had built momentum. Each showing fed the next. People described it not as entertainment but as experience, something lived rather than watched. The creative team, reading these responses, felt a resonance between what they had intended and what the world had received. That rare alignment, the external mirroring the internal, was what they had been chasing all along. The end of the weekend brought reflection more than celebration. The team gathered not to boast but to observe. They looked at how the film moved through conversation, how its imagery lingered, how its rhythm continued to echo. The financial picture, when reviewed, felt less like a report and more like confirmation of order. There were no spikes, no dips, just steady ascent. It was the same shape as the film's emotional journey. Control maintained through motion. By Monday morning, the verdict was clear, though no one needed to speak it aloud. The film had achieved exactly what it set out to. No more, no less. It had not stumbled under the pressure of expectation. It had absorbed it. The audience's response had validated every hour of restraint, every trimmed frame, every calculated choice. The precision that once seemed restrictive had become its signature. In the days that followed, the sense of accomplishment deepened. People began to understand that the first weekend had not been a peak but a tone-setter. It had established not dominance but endurance. The film was going to last, not because it shouted the loudest, but because it was built to hold. The realization carried quiet pride. The team had learned that longevity is its own kind of success, one born not from noise but from balance. When conversations finally moved on to future projects, the memory of that first weekend remained distinct. It had been proof of method. It showed that art made through calm, guided by structure and sustained by discipline, could meet the world on its own terms. The release had mirrored the making. No chaos, no collapse, only rhythm. The people who had lived it carried that rhythm forward into everything after. For them, the weekend's outcome was not a result but a reflection, the world confirming what they already knew. That control, when earned through endurance, becomes its own form of grace. Once the weekend passed and the lights of release dimmed, the film entered its quieter phase, the long corridor of distribution where motion continues without spectacle. For those who had built it, this stage felt both familiar and distant. Their work now traveled through systems they could not see. Networks of agreements, deliveries, statements, each one carrying fragments of what they had made. The story was no longer about creation or anticipation. It was about movement through channels, a transition from art to circulation. Inside these channels, there was no rush, no visible urgency. Everything unfolded according to sequence. The film's path was written in the fine print of its contracts. Who received, who reported, who adjusted. Money passed through stages like current through wires. Steady, necessary, invisible. The people responsible for tracking it had no illusions about speed. They understood that distribution worked in tides. Revenue came in pulses, deductions in intervals, statements in cycles. Their job was not to accelerate but to sustain rhythm. The first layer of distribution touched the obvious points. Theaters, digital platforms, broadcasters waiting for their window. Each represented a different flow of return, a different calendar of deductions and credit. There was satisfaction in seeing the film move outward, but also a strange detachment. The process had an impersonality that contrasted sharply with the intimacy of production. Where once there had been urgency and presence, there was now procedure and patience. The art had become inventory, the product of 1,000 hands now catalogued into columns. The people inside these systems moved with practiced composure. For them, the film was not emotion but entry, a record in a database that must balance precisely. Their care was quiet but genuine. They ensured that contracts were honored, that percentages reached their destinations, that each intermediary fulfilled obligation. Nothing dramatic happened here. Success meant nothing breaking. It was a world of friction managed, not eliminated. In offices where these cycles were tracked, reports arrived with familiar phrasing: allocations, deductions, remittances. Each word carried the texture of distance. For those who had once sweated under lights and pressure, reading such language could feel surreal. Yet they knew that this was how endurance looked: order, not excitement. Every percentage withheld, every delay acknowledged, was simply part of the cost of continuity. Distribution, like editing, was a process of refinement, cutting away chaos until only clarity remained. The deductions began early, as they always do. They came in the form of quiet adjustments, fees, charges, retentions, each small, expected, and necessary. No one argued with them. They were part of the structure. Those who watched the accounts unfold accepted them as the price of reach. The film's movement through markets, territories, and formats required layers of mediation, each one taking a sliver for its service. What remained after those layers was not loss but residue, the clean reflection of process functioning as designed. Some within the team found beauty in that predictability. The system, though mechanical, was fair. Everyone along the chain received what they were owed for the work of carrying something intangible through tangible structures. The accountants who tracked each deduction spoke of it as pulse rather than penalty. In their world, stability mattered more than surprise. They could look at a statement and see not numbers but harmony. Every channel accounted for, every variable resolved. Occasionally, small frictions emerged, a payment arriving late, a calculation questioned, a statement needing revision. These moments of imperfection were met not with frustration but with routine. The people managing them had learned patience long before the film was ever released. They knew that reconciliation was rhythm, not emergency. A delay was a pause in the current, not its disruption. And when resolution came, it carried the satisfaction of something restored to balance. For the creative team, these updates felt like echoes from a distant room. They were reminders that the film still lived somewhere beyond them. Its name continued to appear in reports and correspondence, its influence spreading in invisible ways. They no longer intervened, they observed. What had once been their immediate world had become a slow procession of acknowledgments. And yet, knowing that the system moved, however slowly, brought comfort. It meant the work endured. The contrast between public perception and internal process grew wider over time. To the world, the film was already history, replaced by newer headlines and fresher releases. But inside the industry's corridors, it remained alive, shifting through territories, platforms, and agreements. The accountants, distributors, and coordinators who followed its path treated it not as a relic but as an active file. Its presence lingered in ledgers long after the applause faded. This afterlife, quiet and procedural, was proof of its durability. As the film continued its journey, its pace became slower but more permanent. Residual flows replaced surges. The immediate turned into the steady. The production team, when they occasionally reviewed statements, saw the rhythm flatten into calm. There was something satisfying about that stillness. The frenzy of making and releasing had ended. Now came the peace of process. Every adjustment, every deduction, every cleared payment marked another step toward completion. The most human part of this phase lay in acknowledgement. When final reconciliations were sent, when accounts matched perfectly, there was relief in their precision. No fanfare, no ceremony, just confirmation that everything aligned. The people who handled these processes rarely received thanks, but they knew their work carried quiet honor. They had turned complexity into order, maintained trust where visibility had vanished. By the time the final cycles concluded, the film's financial life had taken on its last shape. It no longer moved with speed or noise. It existed as record, as proof. What had begun with creative urgency and lived through global motion ended in calm accuracy. The distribution's labyrinth had been navigated without collapse, the deductions settled without dispute. The film's journey through money had become symmetrical to its journey through story, relentless pursuit giving way to stillness, uncertainty resolving into understanding. For those who had seen it through, there was quiet pride in the ordinariness of the end. They had learned that stability itself was success, that a clean reconciliation held more beauty than any dramatic windfall. The process had transformed art into artifact, motion into memory. What remained was peace, a sense that every account, every promise, every unseen hand had done its work, and the film had moved through the world as it was meant to, without noise, without loss, without distortion. The longer the film lived in its afterlife of accounts and reconciliations, the more its meaning shifted from immediacy to endurance. The people connected to it began to think less about success and more about completion. Around it hung the quiet question that every film eventually asks: who waits, and who shares? The participants of this story, the financiers, the producers, the crew, the artists, each had their own kind of patience. Some waited for reports, others for residuals, still others for closure that could not be printed or paid. What united them was the rhythm of waiting itself, a rhythm so steady it began to sound like the film's own pulse continuing beyond its final frame. In the first months after distribution, the atmosphere among participants was expectant but calm. The urgency of release had passed. What remained was correspondence. Updates arrived without fanfare. Settlements processing, deductions finalizing, confirmations forthcoming. To those accustomed to immediacy, this new pace felt glacial. Yet it carried its own logic. The system was designed to move slowly so that it could move correctly. The participants understood this, even if patience came uneasily. Waiting became an extension of work, a discipline rather than delay. For the financiers, the waiting held weight. They had given shape to the project long before cameras rolled, and now they watched returns filter back in fragments. Each arrival was less a surprise than a confirmation, proof that their faith had materialized. Yet even as reports arrived, they knew that film accounting does not end cleanly. Residuals continued, adjustments reappeared, territories lingered. They had learned long ago that profit in cinema was a tide, not a transaction. The numbers mattered, but the reassurance mattered more, that the film had held its own, that no piece of the structure had failed. For the producers, the waiting felt like vigilance. Their work had always been to hold the project together, and even now, after completion, they remained its guardians. They monitored the settlements with quiet care, not out of greed but responsibility. Every cleared balance sheet, every finalized statement represented closure not only for them but for everyone who had given their labor to the film. Their patience was communal. They waited on behalf of others. For the artists, the actors, editors, and technicians, the waiting carried a softer meaning. Many had moved on to other projects, yet pieces of this film remained with them. The waiting took emotional form. They waited not for payments or recognition but for the gradual realization that the film had left something permanent in them. They remembered long nights of coordination, the smell of rain on location, the hum of tension that defined the set. For them, the passing of time was not about arrival but about understanding. They were waiting for perspective, and that, too, would come in intervals. Occasionally, small promises resurfaced. A deferred bonus, a late acknowledgement, a residual check months after the last correspondence. These arrivals carried a peculiar warmth. They were reminders that the film still existed in motion somewhere, that its presence, though quieter, continued to ripple outward. Each payment, each final email, each signature arriving in digital ink felt like the soft closing of a door. The project was finishing itself, piece by piece, without drama. The culture of waiting that surrounded the film was not resignation, it was trust. Everyone involved had learned through experience that this was how the process worked. To rush it was to risk imbalance. The systems were complex but dependable. They moved slowly because they carried many hands, and those hands deserved care. The participants waited not as outsiders but as part of a shared understanding. In that understanding lay comfort. For some, the waiting extended far longer. Those who worked on the edges of the production, contractors, smaller departments, freelancers, sometimes watched months pass before their accounts cleared. Yet even they, accustomed to the industry's pulse, treated the waiting as ritual. The film had not failed them, it was simply unfolding in its own time. When their acknowledgments finally came, they arrived not as windfalls but as closure. The acknowledgment itself carried more weight than the sum attached. The sense of who shared and who waited became clearer with time. The larger participants, the financiers, producers, distributors, shared in structure. They divided returns according to design, clean and scheduled. But the smaller participants shared differently. They shared in memory. They carried stories rather than percentages, of exhaustion turned to pride, of patience turned to peace. In their recollections, the film's worth could not be measured by the lines of a statement but by the texture of experience. Waiting had deepened that worth. There were moments, scattered and unscheduled, when these groups reconnected. An email thread revived, a message sent out of courtesy or nostalgia, a reunion over another project. When they spoke of the film, they no longer spoke of money. They spoke of endurance, how the project had tested them, how they had trusted it, how it had eventually kept its promises. That mutual acknowledgement became the truest form of settlement. Each person felt that the film had paid them back in understanding. Over time, the reports slowed to their final pace. Settlements were labeled complete, accounts archived, and names filed under fulfilled. The film's financial life settled into equilibrium. But for those who had lived it, waiting had changed them. They had learned to find calm in intervals, to see time as proof rather than punishment. Waiting had revealed the hidden continuity between art and commerce. Both demanded patience, both required faith. The last arrivals came quietly. No one expected them anymore, yet they appeared like faint echoes, final notices, closing statements, acknowledgments of completion. When these reached the participants, they did not celebrate. They simply exhaled. The journey had reached its end not through applause but through resolution. Everything promised had found its place. Years later, when the film was mentioned, those who had lived its making remembered not only the intensity of production or the precision of its craft but the long patience that followed. They remembered how silence stretched between reports, how small arrivals felt monumental, how endurance became understanding. The financial journey had turned into a lesson about trust. Trust in systems, in people, in time itself. In the end, the participants no longer waited. There was nothing left to expect, yet something remained. The quiet memory of having belonged to something that moved honestly. They had shared in its creation, waited through its completion, and witnessed its closure. That rhythm, the give, the wait, the return, had imprinted itself on them. The film had not only delivered its promises, it had taught them the meaning of patience, and in that patience, they found the truest reward of all, peace. Relief does not arrive with noise. It enters like breath after a long-held pause. For those who had shepherded the film from idea to artifact, that breath came slowly, filtered through confirmation emails, reconciled accounts, and the absence of new demands. The tension that had lived quietly inside each participant began to dissolve, not all at once, but in small recognitions, the kind that replace anxiety with acceptance. After months of vigilance, there was nothing left to fix, nothing left to chase. The film had survived its own making, and that survival felt like grace. The first hint of this relief came not from numbers but from silence. In production, silence means uncertainty. After release, it means completion. The phones that once hummed with urgency now stayed still. Reports arrived on time and without correction. The financial architecture that had once required constant care finally stood on its own. The relief was physical, shoulders easing, breaths deepening, the body remembering rest. It was the kind of quiet that made even small noises, the click of a closing laptop, the rustle of paper, sound like closure. For the producers, the feeling carried weight. They had been the axis between creative vision and financial order, mediators of pressure. Their lives had been structured around problem-solving, improvisation, and control. Now there was nothing left to control. Relief for them was complicated. It brought satisfaction but also a faint emptiness. Purpose dissolves when tension does. They found themselves relearning how to exist without urgency, how to trust stillness after living inside motion. The financiers felt it differently. Their relief came with proof. The final reconciliations confirmed what they had believed in at the start, that trust had been well placed, management sound, and process complete. There were no crises to rewrite, no losses to explain. Every column balanced, every expectation met. Their sense of ease was quiet, almost mathematical. Satisfaction in alignment. In the rhythm of financing, success is not measured by triumph but by absence. No gaps, no disputes, no chaos. To end cleanly is to win. For the creative team, Relief was gentler, almost emotional. The work that had once consumed every waking thought now existed outside of them, independent and intact. They could watch the film and feel distance, the healthy kind that lets memory separate from identity. They could finally see what they had made without flinching, no longer haunted by unfinished edges. The exhaustion of control faded into recognition. The film had its flaws, but they were honest ones, shaped by necessity and effort. There was pride in that imperfection. The relief deepened with time, revealing itself in subtle ways. Days grew quieter, sleep came easier, conversations turned from what went wrong to what was learned. Even finances, usually sterile and detached, carried a tone of calm. The payments that once represented obligation now felt symbolic, a slow echo of a journey concluded. Each transaction closed a small loop, confirming again and again that the project had endured through order. The late arrivals, the final receipts, the deferred balances, felt less like rewards than reminders. Endurance always pays differently, through peace rather than profit. Some felt the relief as release. The endless waiting, the cautious optimism, the patience stretched across years, all of it now belonged to the past. There were no more unknowns left to calculate. The machine had stopped turning, and in its stillness, gratitude replaced strain. People who had been defined by their vigilance rediscovered their humanity. They spoke again of family, of rest, of mornings without deadlines. Relief for them was rediscovery. Yet for all its comfort, the end carried reflection. The team began to see the full shape of cost. Not the financial one, but the internal toll of precision, control, and endurance. The relief exposed what the work had taken. Patience sharpened into fatigue, care hardening into habit, attention stretched into exhaustion. Now that the pressure had lifted, they could feel the weight they had been carrying all along. But instead of regret, they felt awe at having sustained it. The understanding that they had survived together, without fracture, without bitterness, brought its own quiet pride. In small reunions and messages exchanged months later, people spoke of how strange it was to feel peace. They described the relief as weightless yet heavy with meaning. It was not excitement but restoration. Each person found it in a different form, a producer finally turning off his phone before midnight, a crew member watching the film in silence for the first time, a financier reading a report with nothing left to amend. These were small acts, but each carried the feeling of something ending as it should. The idea of cost changed in those days. What once seemed measured in figures now felt human. Time given, energy spent, patience stretched. The relief was proportional to that invisible expense. It didn't erase fatigue. It transformed it. Every hour endured had found its return in calm. Every frustration had dissolved into closure. People who had spent months managing control learned that release was also a form of mastery. To let go with grace required the same discipline that had built the film. As months turned to years, the relief settled into memory. It became less a feeling and more a knowing, the awareness that a project can end cleanly, that not all stories of production must end in chaos. Those who had lived it carried that knowledge forward like a quiet inheritance. They understood now that patience is not a delay but a design, and that the most powerful form of success is peace that lasts. The last remnants of the process, final audits, archived documents, stored equipment, faded into routine. There were no surprises left, no anxieties to chase. Only reflection remained, and with it, gratitude. People spoke of how the film had shaped them, how its discipline had bled into their lives. The financiers talked about trust. The artists talked about restraint. Each found meaning in the memory of control turned into calm. By the end, relief had become perspective. They saw the entire arc, from faith to tension, from control to balance, and understood that every moment of strain had been part of the same pattern. The journey had taught them that cost and relief are not opposites but continuations. The film had demanded patience, precision, and endurance, and it had returned exactly that. Patience rewarded, precision remembered, endurance transformed into stillness. When they thought of it later, they no longer remembered the exhaustion, only the quiet after it. The relief had become its own story, one that needed no applause. It was the sound of stillness filling the space where worry once lived, the steady exhale of people who had carried something heavy, together, and finally put it down. When everything had been said and done, the film stood in stillness, its balances aligned, its obligations closed, its motion transformed into rest. What remained was the plain picture of what all that work had become. The people who had lived it no longer thought in terms of totals. They thought in terms of equilibrium. They had seen how money and meaning had circled one another through every phase of creation, and now that circle had closed. The journey had moved from faith to precision, from precision to calm. Nothing was left to chase. In the final reconciliations, the outcome looked simple. The film had met itself. It neither swelled with excess nor shrank under loss. It existed at the exact point where vision and discipline intersect. Those who looked at the closing statements saw not profit or margin but proportion. Everything found its proper place. The inflow matching the outflow, the giving equal to the return. It was a clean landing, the kind that disappears into quiet rather than fanfare. Within the producers' offices, the tone was measured. They spoke softly, as if loudness would disturb the balance they had achieved. Papers were signed, digital files archived, acknowledgments sent. There was no need for ceremony. The reward was in the normality of it all, accounts closing without dispute, figures that required no adjustment, partners who spoke of satisfaction instead of surprise. In a world accustomed to volatility, such steadiness felt profound. The financiers viewed the final outcome as symmetry. The film had fulfilled what it promised. Stability through control, endurance through restraint. The return was not explosive, but it was complete. Every layer of investment had found its echo in return, each degree of faith mirrored by fulfillment. What they valued most was not gain but consistency. The figures on the page carried the calm tone of alignment, a narrative without distortion. For the creative team, the outcome felt emotional in a different way. They saw beyond the arithmetic. They remembered the rhythm that had carried them, the rush of production, the fatigue, the long wait through post, the measured pace of distribution. Now all that motion had condensed into quiet understanding. The result on paper felt like a reflection of what they had made on screen. A story of pursuit that ends not in explosion but in recognition. The ending, like the film itself, was clean, deliberate, complete. In conversations that followed, people spoke of the result as a form of truth. It was not a miracle and not a disappointment. It was exactly what it needed to be. The system had worked, the structure had held, and the film had justified its existence. Even those who lived by numbers found poetry in that. A film that spends its life exploring balance had found balance in its own making. The world, for once, had mirrored intention. The final reports arrived with the same precision that had guided every other stage. Percentages distributed, deductions finalized, acknowledgments received. Each message was the echo of closure. Confirmed, approved, completed. The repetition of those words became its own rhythm, replacing the tension of creation with the ease of conclusion. The film's life in finance had come full circle. The motion of money had slowed to rest. The flow of effort had turned into stillness. For the accountants and coordinators, the end felt personal. Their work, often invisible, had shaped the journey's quiet success. They saw the film's outcome not as mere balance but as harmony. Every deduction and reconciliation had meaning. Every document carried the texture of patience. The film had taught them, too, that order is its own kind of art, that accuracy can be as moving as emotion when it protects something fragile from chaos. The people who had once lived in the film's noise began to look back on it with new eyes. They realized that what they had built was not just a story of pursuit, but a system of integrity. Each choice, each trade-off, had been part of a greater logic. Now, in the stillness of completion, they could see it all clearly. The true narrative wasn't about chase or revelation, it was about alignment. how every piece of the process, creative and financial alike, had met at a single point of calm. The atmosphere around the project changed. There was no longer talk of pressure or uncertainty, only the shared recognition that the work had landed exactly where it should. The director spoke of satisfaction without pride, the crew of exhaustion without regret. The financiers spoke of completion without hesitation. It was a rare state of unanimity, an ending that everyone could believe in. Outside, the world had already moved on. New releases, new ambitions, new risks. But for those who had lived this film, the quiet of its conclusion lingered. They had witnessed something rare, a creative and financial cycle that ended in balance, without rupture or residue. It proved that discipline could coexist with emotion, that control could protect rather than restrict. The outcome had not shouted its victory, it had whispered it, steady and assured. As months passed, the film's numbers faded from memory, but the feeling remained. The people who had guided it carried that equilibrium into everything they touched afterward. They had learned that peace, not profit, was the real reward of precision. A film could make its mark not through magnitude but through completeness, through the serenity of knowing that every promise had been met, every cost justified, every choice understood. When they spoke of it later, they described the ending as inevitable, the only one it could have had. The film had begun with pursuit and ended with clarity. Its making had mirrored that same journey. Nothing about it was excessive, and nothing was missing. It stood, financially and artistically, in balance, a rare still point in a restless industry. Two choices stood out as the ones that helped most. The first was the decision to stay small in energy while large in focus. When the early conversations began, there had been pressure to escalate, to make the next film louder, broader, more expensive. But the core team had chosen the opposite. They tightened instead of expanding, treating control as their anchor. That single decision had protected the project from chaos. It kept emotion within range, ideas within reach, schedules within reason. They realized later that this choice had done more than save money. It had preserved meaning. It allowed the film to feel human even while built on the scale of systems. That restraint became the thread that held everything together. The second choice was to trust rhythm over reaction. At several moments, external expectations threatened to pull the film off course. Requests for faster results, stronger marketing, wider appeal. Each time, the leadership chose to keep pace instead of accelerating. They learned to measure success in pulses rather than peaks, to hold tempo when the world demanded noise. That refusal to rush became their quiet victory. It taught everyone involved that pace, when held with conviction, can be its own form of courage. In later years, many who worked on the film would say that the discipline of rhythm changed how they approached everything afterward, not only work but life itself. But there had been frictions too, and they carried their own instruction. The first was communication under pressure. During production, information had often traveled unevenly between creative and logistical spheres. Misunderstandings were rare but impactful, like ripples that distorted the calm surface of coordination. Everyone learned that clarity is not volume, it is patience. The moments that faltered reminded them that trust cannot survive assumption. It needs attention. By the time they reached post-production, that lesson had embedded itself into their reflexes. They began to listen slower, to speak with precision. The friction became refinement. The second friction came from fatigue, the inevitable shadow of intensity. The film's controlled energy demanded constant presence, and presence demands endurance. In the quiet after completion, many realized how thinly stretched they had been, how much they had relied on momentum to disguise depletion. That awareness changed their definition of professionalism. They began to understand that sustainability is not laziness but intelligence, that the ability to rest is as vital as the ability to persist. This friction had hurt in the moment but healed in retrospect. It taught them that craft cannot thrive without compassion for those who carry it. Amid these lessons, one pattern emerged, the recognition that every film mirrors the people who make it. The calm that audiences praised, the precision they admired, the rhythm they remembered. All of it existed because the team had lived those qualities under pressure. The process had been a rehearsal for the art itself. Each financial balance mirrored an emotional one. Each creative constraint reflected an inner one. The more the team aligned with that rhythm, the more the film aligned with truth. It was not planned, but it became inevitable. In retrospect, they realized they had not been building a movie, they had been learning how to move together, how to keep stillness inside motion. Over time, that understanding deepened. When they spoke of what the experience had taught them, they used fewer words. They described patience without naming it, focus without defining it, humility without announcement. They no longer spoke of success or profit or even acclaim. They spoke of tone, how a project's energy can determine its outcome, how the atmosphere behind the camera can shape what appears in front of it. They saw now that money, story, and mood are not separate currents. They are one river moving through different terrains. When the flow is even, everything holds. The financiers reflected on their own change. What began for them as risk management had turned into something closer to faith. They learned that investing in clarity of vision yields steadier returns than investing in ambition. The clean outcome of the film had proven that stability can generate beauty. The rhythm of funding, the timing of release, the patience of return, each was a form of storytelling in its own right. They came to see art and finance not as opposites but as parallel disciplines, each requiring trust, precision, and grace under pressure. For the creative team, the pattern of restraint became muscle memory. In later projects, they carried that same sense of proportion. The awareness that limits are not cages but frames, and that a film's honesty depends on its ability to live within its own rhythm. They no longer sought spectacle. They sought alignment. They had learned that power lies not in expansion but in exactness, that beauty grows from compression. This understanding, born from exhaustion and balance alike, became their quiet standard. When they met again years later, some by chance, others by plan, the memories unfolded slowly, like scenes replaying in gentle light. They remembered not the struggle but the symmetry. The film had aged well, its control and restraint holding their strength over time. What had once felt like compromise now looked like clarity. They realized that their calm approach had given the story permanence. Its quietness had turned into endurance. As the conversations ended, they found closure not in praise but in comprehension. They had each carried fragments of the same lesson, and now, gathered again, those fragments formed a whole. The film had taught them the discipline of proportion, the truth that endurance is more valuable than explosion, that patience can carry a story farther than ambition. What mattered most was not what they gained but what they understood. The quiet clarity at the end was not conclusion but continuation. The experience had shown them how to navigate creation without being